help with the voice. So you might want to sit on this side. You will get to get affected.
Okay, well, I'll dig in and see if anyone else shows up, but feel free to ask questions at any point in time since it's just a few of you. So my talk today is the Hitchhiker's Guide to Joining the Open Source Community and Joining Kubernetes, very loosely on the theme, but mostly just in how fun the slides are, very heavy on joining the open source community. So a little bit about me. My name is Cailyn Edwards. I'm a senior infrastructure security engineer at Shopify. I'm also a Cloud Native Computing Foundation ambassador. I'm a regular member of Kubernetes 6 Security as well as Kubernetes 6 CLI and do lots of contributing there. I have these emojis at the bottom that are roughly in line with my hobbies. I am a huge dog fan, big dog mom. I have 2 adorable dogs at home that I miss so much. I'm a big fan of plants. I was actually a farmer before getting into software not that long ago. I'm really into food, so particularly Mexican food. I lived in Mexico for a few years when I was younger and loved it. I'm a Olympic runner since the pandemic. A squash player, didn't have a good emoji for squash. A sewist, I often make a lot of my clothes, not here because I want to look nice, but typically I do make a lot of my own clothes, and I'm a big adventurer. Do lots of hiking, kayaking, biking, all of that stuff. So let's dig into it. I wanted to talk a little bit about my open source journey. I have been involved in open source for not that long, actually, relative to most people, about a year of very solid contributions. So I went to KubeCon EU last year in France, and I just fell in love with the community. I went to a 6 security meeting and they were so welcoming and engaging. I thought, man, like I want to hang out with these people more. So I started to think about how I could get involved, and I had a very ambitious plan. I submitted a talk to the KubeCon North America CFP that was, I don't know, some long complicated title because that's kind of my shtick. But it was something along the lines of like from zero to open source contributor. And it was going to be me telling the story of how I went from not ever having made an open source contribution to being a Kubernetes org member in 4 months. Spoiler, my talk did not get accepted, but I did accomplish my goal. And along the way, I had a whole bunch of exciting things happen. So I joined 6 Security via their mailing list. I ended up coming to meetings. As people started recognizing me, I got pretty brave and started contributing through documentation, code review, and just conversations as well was a pretty impactful thing that I did. And after I started making these contributions, it was getting close to KubeCon North America. I had decided I wasn't going to go because I didn't have a talk accepted and it was a lot of traveling. And then I got an email from a friend saying I had been nominated for a contributor award, which blew my mind because I hadn't felt like I had done anything that meaningful. But now, after being in the community a lot, I realized how impactful it is just to make contributions and to show up and to bring other people into the community. And I understand why they felt that I was deserving of that award. So I changed my plans, went to KubeCon, attended my first contributor summit, which was an absolute blast. Getting to hang out with like really, really prominent members of the Kubernetes community, got my award. That was on my opening slide. I was very happy to receive that award. And since then, I have participated in an open source program at Shopify where I spent all my working hours contributing to open source and building Shopify's relationship with that. And I continue to contribute to security when I can, and I have spoken at KubeCon as well as Cloud Native Security Con, and just recently was selected to be a CNCF ambassador, which comes with a whole bunch of really sweet perks and means that I have to do things like this regularly where I go out and talk about Cloud Native Computing Foundation, open source, and just try and get people pumped about it. So this is a rough agenda of today's talk. We're going to go over what open source is, what it means, and some of the terminology. I'm sure most people are familiar, but just in case, I want to make sure that we enter the conversation with an equal understanding of the terms that I'm going to use. Then we're going to talk about contributing, what it means, and how you should do it. Then we'll go into some of the projects that I'm familiar with. There are a whole bunch of open source projects, so it's important to know that, as I said, I'm still only been in the community for a year, and while I'm very experienced in the Kubernetes and Cloud Native sphere, there are so many wonderful open source projects outside of that that I'm less experienced in, and I'll try and mention, but definitely they deserve a whole talk on their own. And lastly, I'll talk a little bit about employer buy-in and how you can get your employer to support things like this, because, well, it's really great to contribute to open source out of the kindness of your heart. In order to have a sustainable community, we really need to make sure that we're being compensated for these efforts.
So before you contribute in open source, you choose Kubernetes because that's like what you were working on a lot and you're like specialized in. How specialized were you to be able to contribute in those?
I'll get into it a little bit later, the different levels. Personally, I have a lot of coding and software experience, but that wasn't where I was able to make contributions right away. Definitely my focus was more on just figuring out what the tech stack is at all and what the code base looks like actually in Kubernetes, which spoilers is crazy and very complicated. So yeah, it'll depend a little bit. I would say pretty average level of expertise and was able to make really significant contributions despite that. And I'm much more experienced for having done it. So what is open source? I assume most people have heard of it. Have you heard of open source? Perfect, awesome. So when I first got started in software, actually even before I got involved in software, my husband was a software developer and would mention open source projects to me. And I thought wow, that's very cool. I want to do that. I assumed it was just a project with its code publicly available. I didn't realize that there are a set of standards and principles that open source projects have to follow, and licensing that dictates what an open source project has to do. So let's go over the definition and some details of open source software. This is a little bit tough to read, and I'm not going to read it, but it's very funny. And when I share the deck after, you should read it. This is Zayvon Eaglebrox, president of the universe, and his opinion on open source. But what it boils down to is open source software is free to use, change, and distribute. Sometimes it's built by companies and then released as open source. Sometimes it's built by a group of people and open source from the get-go. But what it boils down, or the principles that it has to meet, are that it is open and free to use and distribute and change. So we'll go over the terminology that I think is the most important and the one that I'm going to use throughout this talk. So first is the project. This is the actual software itself, the buildable product, whatever it is. So Kubernetes is the open source project. And then repository, this is where you can access the code. Generally, this is through some sort of software version control. Most typically, it would be on GitHub. Fork, this is a complete copy of the original software. So again, this is often something through version control. It can be done so that you can make a specific change that you or your company needs. It can also be done as part of the contributor workflow for Kubernetes when you want to make a contribution or whatever Kubernetes repository you want to work on, and then you push your changes to the main repository. Next is upstream. This is that repository that is used to build the project. So this is where the code lives. This also can just refer in general to a project that you're using. So Shopify uses Kubernetes, and when I make a contribution to Kubernetes, they say I'm working upstream. Downstream is the end users. That's who's using the project. Those are the people that we really want to get involved in contributing upstream because they have the most insight about what the project needs. Maintainer, this is a project owner, but it doesn't necessarily mean the person who created or built the product. This is someone who is responsible for reviewing pull requests, for doing code review, and a really important responsibility of a maintainer is maintaining the project's vision or goals. So when an open source project gets created and gains interest, like Kubernetes, or you have hundreds of thousands of people using it, everyone has their own unique perspective on how that project should look and what it should do, and they're going to be submitting literally thousands and thousands of issue requests. And those issue requests might be really great in their own right, but they might not contribute to the overall idea of the project. And we deal with this all the time in software where we're trying to build something. So you need someone who knows, okay, this is what the project stands for, these are our goals, and they're going to triage and accept issues based on that. And it is a very tough role. Often maintainers are burnt out. So if you have any interest in doing this sort of thing, there are lots of mentorship opportunities in open source. Lastly, contributor. This is hopefully everyone in this room at some point, but it's anyone who makes any sort of change or contribution to a project. You don't have to do this on an ongoing basis to be a contributor. If you have made a contribution to open source, you are a contributor for life. So the open source way, there are strict guidelines for open source projects. Complete details can be found in the open source definition, which I link at the end of the presentation. I could do a whole presentation on this alone. It's really interesting, but we'll just go over some of the parts that I found really interesting and relevant. So transparency, what this means is that when you're running an open source project, you can't do things behind closed doors. So the whole community has to be able to have access to meetings, to information. How this manifests in projects that I've worked on is that all meetings have to be recorded. Those meetings follow a code of conduct. For example, the CNCF code of conduct basically boils down to be excellent to each other, and that's how we start every meeting. Is we remind everyone of the code of conduct, we record. You can't have private channels in the Slack orgs. Everything needs to be discoverable so that if people want to join the project or if people want to find out why a decision was made, they can do that. Collaboration. This is the cornerstone of open source. We want people to be able to work on projects. We don't want to reject people based on their experience level. We want to try and make it as easy as we can for any person to come and be involved in the project. Release early and often. This one is less of an enforced principle and more of an ideal. So Kubernetes is huge, and they do have a really strict release process that happens, I think, twice a year. They have a rotating team for this, and it's really great. If you're a smaller project and you're already burnt out, you might not be able to do this, but it is something to aim for, because when you have people contributing to open source, they want to see those changes actually make it into the product. So if you submit your PR, you do all the waiting to get it reviewed, to make all those changes, and then you have to wait another 6 or 8 months to actually see that change in production, it can be really disheartening. So I think that this is a really effective way to get people engaged and pumped about their contributions. The next one is inclusive meritocracy. So what this means is anyone is allowed to put forward an idea, and we select those ideas based on their merit. So any person can make a suggestion, and it's really important that we're not saying like, oh, we should default to this person's ideas because they've been part of the community the longest. Again, we need to go back to those original principles for the project and make the decision that's going to be best for the project and the community that uses it. Community, that's why I'm here. This has been the biggest impact to me personally for joining open source. I've found a community of people who every day make me feel valued and included and are just really wonderful people. The kind of people who end up involved in open source are generally people who are working on it on their free time and then find ways to get paid. So they really care about it, and they want you to care about it, and they're so happy if you just show up. It's really wonderful. So another aspect of open source software is licensing. So it has to be licensed to make sure that someone doesn't come along and say, wow, this open source project is really great. I'm going to take all the code, monetize it, and get rich. So it must be freely available without cost, royalty, or fees of any kind. That's just open source. It must be distributed as source code for programmers and compiled code for end users. So both aspects of the project have to be accessible. End users and programs may alter the program's code. So this means, yes, you can submit a change to be part of production, but what it also means is you can make a private fork of that and change it to suit your needs. But if you do that, the modified source code must be redistributed under the same conditions as the license for the original version. So you don't have to redistribute it. You can only use it for your company if you want, but if you decide that you said, oh, I've added this feature and I think it's really beneficial, and the maintainers don't want to pull it into the upstream project, I'm going to release a version of that. It has to be distributed under the same conditions as the original one. And then no discrimination against persons or groups. Our community does not function if we are not inclusive, so there is absolutely zero tolerance in open source for any kind of discrimination. So why should we get involved? I'm here speaking at a conference with a really specific audience, women in cybersecurity, and that's intentional. And we're going to get into some of the reasons why I think specifically the people at this conference would be very valuable to be involved in the open source world. So every year they do a report on open source software projects. They have a subset of projects that are available on GitHub that they scan, and they produce or publish the results. So I've cherry picked some of the points that I think are really interesting. So of all the scanned projects, 96% contained open source code. And in those cases, it was 76% of the entire code base was open source. So this is not necessarily just code in the project, but maybe included dependencies. There's cases where you have like your Go files there and your dependencies included. So there is a bit of skew there, but regardless, even with it being dependencies, there are a whole bunch of open source pieces of software in most projects that we interact with. And 84% of those code bases that were scanned contained vulnerabilities. And I think 48% of those vulnerabilities were high risk. So there are a whole bunch of security risks that are being made publicly available, and people are pulling into their projects, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly. And there's a real risk, not only just because the vulnerabilities are there, but also it's open source. So they're publicly there. Anyone can go and find it. Everyone can look at that code. Hackers are going to hack. And it's very easy if they go pick a project that's particularly vulnerable and they find every code base that's pulling that project in. So security professionals have a really, really strong value to the open source community. And then the other side of it, of course, is representation. Much like the rest of software, the open source community is primarily men, primarily white men. This is from 2017, so I would hope that these numbers are a little bit better. I would expect that these numbers are a little bit better, but not enough. It's never really enough. So you can see, I don't need to say these numbers, they suck. And so the more women that we have, the better. And this is definitely biased, not at all science, but I think that community is aided by the diverse opinions that women bring to the group. I feel welcomed by other women in the community very frequently. And this isn't just me saying, I want to see more women in open source because I am a woman and I like that. There's real business value in having a diverse representation in your company. There was a study done that showed that, I'm not gonna read what's on the slide, but showed basically that having a diverse set of employees means you're going to build a product for a diverse set of customers, and that's the world. So when you have just a bunch of white men building a product, it's very likely that that product is primarily going to appeal to a bunch of white men. And so if you need to sell it to your employer, which hopefully you don't have to because it's 2023, there is real monetary value in ensuring that you have a diverse set of people working on a project. And in open source, it's the same. We need more people helping us to build a product for more people. And of course, another reason to get involved is to make friends and do cool stuff. It's very fun. I've made a lot of good friends in the open source community. My whole team is remote in my day job, and that's tough. Like, I connect with them a little bit, but not enough. Whereas I come to all of these conferences and I get to see people that I work with, not because we both get a paycheck from the same megacorp, but because we're really passionate about the project that we work on, and that's been really great for making me feel connected to the software community. So let's talk about actually contributing, doing the thing. I've just spent a whole bunch of time telling you why I think you should get involved in open source, but the really important question is why you want to get involved in open source. If you don't select a strategy, if you just try and jump in, then you won't be able to work on things that are going to make you feel really fulfilled and valued. So I said for me it was community, and that means I come and I do things like this because it makes me feel fulfilled to do that, and I build community, but that might not be what you want out of it. And so I'll talk about some of the different ways that open source can provide value to you. The first one is to deepen your skills. So there are a few different things here. One, you're brand new to the industry and you want to onboard, you're seeing all these job postings that say 3 years experience, 5 years experience, you must have owned a company, and it's really intimidating and hard to get that experience. Open source will give it to you for free. Come on in, write code, do pull requests, and the nice thing is it's open source. So you can share the work that you've done directly with prospective employers, and they can see that reflected and being used in the real world. There is a disclaimer. If you're brand new, as I said, we're burnt out, we're overwhelmed, there's not enough people contributing to open source projects. These are Kubernetes, for example, is used by huge companies that make tons of money, and they don't pay very many people to work on it full time. So it's unlikely that someone is going to jump and go out of their way to mentor you. What you need to do is show up enough that we have faith that you're going to stick around and there's going to be a return on the investment. But if you do that, as I said, people will be so enthusiastic to help you learn and grow. Another reason or way you might want to deepen your skills is you're applying for a new job and there's a specific language or tool that you're a little bit familiar with, but you'd like to be more familiar with, or you just want to have some tangible experience to share. You can go pick a project that, say it's Golang. Kubernetes is a great place to learn Golang. And then the other one is if you've got a tool that you really enjoy and you want to bring into your company, go jump into the open source world and get to know it so that you can share it. Which leads into the next one, which is improving the tools you use. I'm sure we've all, when you work in software, you become aware of every little fault with all of the software that we use in every aspect of our life, and you run into a bug and you want to fix it. If it's open source, you can, and please do. At the very least, open an issue and let us know. But that's a great way to start getting involved in another really low barrier to entry is if you're using a software and you're like, the documentation sucks, so this case is missed, come in and add that documentation. That work is invaluable. And the next one falls into the representation category, which is you get to become part of a global community. I don't know how many people work with Kubernetes, but if you're working Kubernetes, there's some big celebrities, Tim Hockin and Kelsey Hightower and Liz Rice is another big name. And for me, those were celebrities in my job, and now I get to work with them sometimes and have them review PRs, and that's, to me, very cool. To my husband, very nerdy. And so I just wanted to make a note. I'm not going to talk too much about them, but there are training programs that are paid, fellowships and mentorship programs that will get you into open source, show you exactly what projects need your work, and they're awesome and amazing, and that's a great way to do it without having to do that work unpaid, and I've linked those at the end of the presentation as well. So if you have now been convinced that you would like to contribute, we'll go into the different ways that you can contribute. The first one, and I think the most valuable one, is documentation. This is often a really nice way to start contributing, and I know women often get pigeonholed into writing documentation. This is not that. The head of the Kubernetes docs project is a man, and he's awesome. And I don't want you to do documentation forever, but for me, doing documentation was a place where I could pick what I wanted to work on in a technical or design capacity and learn about it as I improve the documentation. And there's work everywhere. So if there are docs missing, as I said, you can add those. If the existing docs suck or aren't inclusive, you can update those. And another big value is if you speak a language other than English, we really need to translate and localize documentation so that open source software is available outside of English-speaking countries. The next one is operational. Again, this tends to be something that women get pushed into, so don't feel pressure, but if you enjoy it, it is very valued in the open source community to organize meetings, help onboard new members, plan upcoming work. This is in Kubernetes done as a chair role, so you would just organize for a special interest group, but there are a whole bunch of different ways to do that. There's also every release that Kubernetes has, just before the release, they open up an application period where you can join as a shadow for that release, and that is very, very fun. I've done that, and I learned a whole bunch, and it's just a limited commitment period, which is nice. The next one, of course, code. This can be through looking at open issues, hopefully labeled with good first issue, not always. Refactoring and improving the code. A lot of this code was written ages ago by people who are really excited about languages being new or some tool, and there's lots and lots of room for improvement in that code. And so if that's something you enjoy doing, please come do it anywhere. Reviewing PRs, that's a nice way to get started. It feels like it would be intimidating, but generally open source projects have a lot of controls so that you can't just merge something without the proper approvers. You have people that are set up to approve, so you can go in there, you can look at it, if you see any mistakes, highlight them, and then just put a comment that says looks good to me, and that will help the reviewer say someone else has already vetted it, and it will also make you make your presence in the community known. Advocacy, that's what I'm doing here today, spreading the word, telling people about open source projects, speaking at conferences. If you've used an open source tool and you really like it, go talk about it because they don't have that many people to represent their tools. Give talks, do it. It's the nice thing. It's nice for your career as well, that work. So now we'll dig into projects. So again, it's going to be heavily focused on what I have experience in, but there are dozens more out there if you're interested. So these are the ones that I'm the most familiar with. You can see the languages that they focus on here. For CNCF and OWASP, there are lots and lots of projects under these. So there's pretty much any language or framework that you want to learn can be found in there. And then I've linked in the onboarding section the contributor guides and lists of projects for those. And now we will talk a little bit about Kubernetes. I know I've been talking about it the whole time because it's what I know, but we'll go into some of the details and specifically how you can start to get involved. So step one is to find a SIG or a special interest group. For me, that was SIG security. Typically, if you're a security person, you'll join more than one SIG because SIG security is responsible for securing the entire product. So if you have another area of expertise or interest, you can do both of those things. And linked here at the bottom, there's a list of all the SIGs, and in there is the mailing list. And if you sign up for the mailing list, you get invited to the meetings, and that is the best way to start to get involved with open source. Everyone will be very happy to see you. You'll get to introduce yourself, and you can hear about what folks are actually working on now. And yeah, so it's so important to show up. It can be really intimidating. When I tried to do that talk proposal, I jumped in with both feet and I went into every channel and said, like, what's a good first issue? Who wants to mentor me? And it was radio silence because everyone's exhausted and no one has time for that. And they have no idea if I just want something on my resume so I can get a job or if I'm really interested about it. So the most powerful thing you can do is pick one or two special interest groups and just go to the meetings. And when they see you at 3 meetings, oh my gosh, this is a person who's going to stick around, and they're going to do everything in their power to make it appealing for you to keep working with them and contributing. And then start contributing. Once maybe you're in a special interest group meeting and you hear about a project that's interesting or that you're an expert in the field and you can be helpful, you can go to talks, you can review those PRs, update missing documentation, whatever kind of contribution you want. But just start doing it. Start doing small ones wherever you want. I think my first one was like, I reviewed a blog post, and then the next week I was listed as an author on the blog post. Like, well, this is great for my resume, but I did nothing except say maybe this isn't grammatically correct. So that kind of stuff is easy to feel like you're doing a lot, even though the effort is pretty low initially. And then for Kubernetes, you can become an organization member. There's a specific set of criteria that's linked at the bottom, but basically you need to have at least 1 merged PR and 2 other notable contributions. Though, I mean, I say notable, not at all notable. 2 other contributions, full stop. And then you get 2 people who are reviewers on a project to sponsor you. You open an issue, and very, very quickly you will find someone will come and approve that, and voila, you're an org member. And from there, the possibilities are pretty much endless, and depending on your personal goals, you can just keep contributing slowly when you have time. If that's all you're after, you can start reviewing PRs. You can become a sub-project lead if you have your own idea. One that came up recently for SIG security was a sub-project security self-assessment. So a woman joined the team with absolutely no technical experience, and she said, I think it's really important that the different components of Kubernetes have their own security audits to make sure that there's not giant vulnerabilities there. And since then, she's managed 2 major projects coming through, working with them to do a data flow diagram, a threat model, and then they end up with a triage list of security vulnerabilities for them to work on and for new contributors to come and tackle, which is amazing. You can become an approver. That one has a little bit more responsibility to it. You're actually going to be tagged in a significant number of issues that will need approving, and if you don't meet the requirements, I think you get knocked down. So that's optional. Becoming a chair. Again, a chair is that operational role for a SIG, and then a tech lead is not at all operational, but being in charge of that tech direction for a specific small part of Kubernetes, and so much more. There's tons and tons of options. So if you're looking for leadership and career growth, there really are a whole bunch of avenues for that in open source and in Kubernetes in particular. So now the kind of tough part, particularly in this economy, is although I am very, very passionate about open source, I don't think that we should be doing this work for free, particularly on projects that giant companies are benefiting from. I think that it sets a bad precedence, and it's tough because I want to do the work and I love the work, but in this economy especially, you're seeing people cut things that don't have direct translation to profit. So all of this is taken with a grain of salt because it's tough right now. Sometimes it's easier when the market's a bit hotter, but it is hard. The way I like to do it is create a business case, just like with any new feature, or if you were proposing a new vendor for the company to use, you need to sell it to your pointy-haired boss in a way that they understand, that aligns with their goals. Maybe that's OKRs or top level goals, but whatever it is, you want to present it to them in a way that it's more than you just saying, hey, I'd really like to do this, and it's like a very formal businessy situation. And the way that you can make this business case strong is contributing to a project that your company already uses. Ideally, you can highlight how you can improve that project to work better for your company, or how being a part of that community would allow you to have sway on the project direction, which we all know isn't true because of what I said earlier. Ideally, we're looking out for the complete or for the best interest of the project, not of the companies using it. But we can be a little loosey-goosey with that. You can leverage your professional development time. This is how I started at Shopify. We get about 20% time for professional development. So I started doing this. I started working at Kubernetes 1 day a week. I just went in and said, I'm doing open source stuff. I made it security adjacent. And when I was doing impact reviews or self-reflections, I cited how this work made me better at my day job, which it did. Like, this is not faking it. I am a much better employee because of this work, but trying to sell that in advance can be tough. Find a project that'll help your company. So maybe your company doesn't have that many open source projects, or maybe they're not open source security projects. You can look through these open source projects and find something that you think fills a void that your company has or fixes a problem, and that's a really great way. That's a really great way to get support for open source. An important note here is don't advocate for something just because you want to learn it. That's really tough because, like, the most fun ones maybe have no impact to your company. But again, for this long-term support of open source, we need to play nice with the execs and the people who are making the call whether or not you can do this. And again, yeah, keeping your company informed about upstream changes. So from a security perspective, it's really nice to be in the meetings where we hear about big security vulnerabilities and being able to make roadmap decisions based on that information that maybe isn't going to go public for a few weeks. It also means that you can, while you can't influence directly the tool, you can make suggestions for things that might make the tool better for your company and other companies. And like, actually, no, this is my next slide. And the one that I think doesn't get enough clout is highlighting the significance of community presence. Like, having end users at the table in open source discussions is so valuable and so important. And it's more likely that your issues and your concerns are going to get tackled if you're actually showing that your company is willing to give back to the open source community. So I just want to reiterate that this is really hard. I have struggled with this. The support has gone up and down. We've seen big changes in my company where I'm no longer spending all of my time working on open source. I am back to spending 20% of my time. But it's really important, and it's really important when you talk to people who spend their time working in open source to acknowledge this, that hopefully they are getting paid for that work, and that the work that they're doing is really valuable, and that it's not the people in this room that are benefiting from that work. It's giant companies who are making tons and tons of money. So anything we can do to have this work valued, I think, is really important. So if you want to talk more about open source or security or anything in general, you can find me on Slack, on the Kubernetes and SIG security Slacks, which are up here if you scan the QR code. My handle is Cailyn Codes. I'm also on LinkedIn. There's not that many people with my same first name, so hopefully you can find me. These are some of the resources. I'll share these slides somewhere in the Slack for the Day of Security and anywhere else. And that's it. That's the talk today. I went a little faster than I anticipated. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you. And if not, that's okay as well. Thank you so much for coming.
When you say like you start with like the documentation and all that stuff, right? Was it like just like a task that was posted saying this is needed, or like how do you even find that thing that because I love documentations and then I love learning that, you know, like do it and then read the documentation. I'm like, this is like outdated. Like this is what I do doing my job as well, right? So how do you find that place where you started?
Yeah, for Kubernetes, there's a Slack channel that's SIG Docs. And in there, the chair, Tim, will often post, like, this is a good first issue. If someone wants to get started, you can work on this. If they'll do like, oh, if you're a security person and you want to work on this documentation, they'll post those issues. It's tough though, because like maybe you're feeling really motivated and there's nothing in the channel that day, and that sucks to lose that motivation. So if you go to the SIG documentation repository, they are really, really good about having issues that are labeled good first issues. But if all of that fails and you're not finding any issues, if you see documentation and it sucks, just open a PR. Just like, I read this documentation, I thought that this was inconsistent or this was missing. Here's my suggestion, and maybe it won't get accepted, maybe it will, which is like awesome, immediate first contribution. But if it doesn't get accepted, it's very likely that because you put that effort in, someone's going to be like, I don't think we need to do this right now, but would you do this and also this and this and this and this, and then you're just set for life.
SIG is just for Kubernetes, right? Or SIG is like,
It depends on, SIG means special interest group. So in Kubernetes, or in CNCF, it's tag, which I assume the G is also group, but I don't know what the T, but really it's just like a focused group. And I would guess other projects that are big have that, but small projects have like 6 people who do everything generally. So Kubernetes is a very large example. Usually you just hop in a repo and it's like this one maintainer who's like, oh, please, we have no documentation. So if you write anything, we would love that. A how-to guide.
Yeah. In my work, we also do like Kubernetes and stuff, and it is like not a lot of documentation. So I would say, and like I was having hard time looking for like how do you hook it up with like the elastic storage or like a permanent storage, you know, because it's like the pod, right? So it like died.
Yeah.
But sometimes you need something to stay on there. You don't want it to keep grabbing
Stateful
it.
Kubernetes
Like,
is
every
very
time.
hard.
Right? So I'm like, I was like, so I'm like bilingual. Like I also read and like do Chinese and English, right? So I was even to the point I was like reading Chinese people's documentation. I'm like, how do I figure this out?
With Kubernetes, one tough thing with things like that is because they're a giant open source project used by everyone, there are a bunch of rules for the documentation. So you can't include any project that's not open source as a suggested tool. And they try really hard not to be prescriptive. Like for security professionals, Kubernetes is super interesting because they're like, here's your configuration. There's all the defaults are insecure. And everyone's like, you just made the default secure. And we're like, we don't want you to think Kubernetes is secure because then it's on us. We're telling you it's not secure by default. You need to make that decision. And so it might not be like the documentation might not be missing, but might be something that needs to exist outside of the direct Kubernetes documentation because they're not allowed to have a formal opinion about what you should use if you're trying to have stateful Kubernetes. I would also assume it's just because it's hard and people haven't figured out a good way. We made an internal tool for it because we were having so many issues trying to get stateful pods.
Oh yeah. And then there's like a lot of side products that's like using Kubernetes concept, like, you know, Rancher and all that. I'm like it tells me to how do you like look at the logs. And then like Rancher was like the logs was in like totally different place. I'm like,
oh yeah.
I don't know, like
it's really tough. I feel like I've been working in Kubernetes now for 5 years, and I feel like every time I talk to someone about it, it's like, I really feel like I should be more confident in my language using it because I work with it every day. But it's so big and it's so changing. So it's changing so frequently, and there are so many tools and like tools that everyone just uses. So people talk about it like it's built in, but it's not built in. It's I'm going to try and do a talk at KubeCon in Chicago that is like Kubernetes for someone who has never heard of it. And I think, I don't care if anyone comes to the talk, I think I'm going to learn so much just writing that talk. Like Kubernetes for literal babies.
I wish I like got exposed to these like when I was like at school or something. At least I have some like understanding in it. But like I went in like blank, and then they're like, yeah, like kubectl journal, like whatever journey, whatever. Like look at the log, what happened? I'm like, I don't even have the sense of like the pods. Like how do you spun up something? What do you mean spun it up? Like you know. So yeah, definitely there. Like you said, it was like a lot to grow.
Well, and the terminology is all super overloaded, which sucks. Like how many times does the word service need to be used? Like, what does it mean? What is a service? Tell me, like, what is this service? We have like data pods versus Kubernetes pods at Shopify, and it's a nightmare. So it's very tough. I don't envy anyone joining the community, trying to get on board with terminology.
I have a question. So I have the vendor risk management program in my portfolio, and there's a lot of debate about like open source versus commercial when it comes to like which is the most secure way to go. And you know, the idea being like, obviously Kubernetes has a lot of attention, a lot of people working as the hot thing, but then we see lots of projects that were the hot thing and they're not the hot thing anymore. And unlike a vendor where they discontinue and then it's just dead and you know that, sometimes they just kind of wither on the vine at the time. So what's your thought on that, and how can you make sure like to sell open source products to the company without addressing like, I want a vendor to sign off that this is secure?
Yeah, that is really tough. And you just saw Microsoft just released they're doing a long-term support version of Kubernetes, their own fork, for exactly that reason, is that people who use Kubernetes and we're releasing so frequently, and everyone's bad at Kubernetes, so people aren't able to keep up with the newest versions, so they're reaching the end of life, and they're like 6 versions behind my company is that. So I don't have a good answer. Like really what the answer is if you pay your employees to keep working on these projects, then these projects are going to continue to be healthy and useful. And so it's like a chicken and an egg where like if you take this on and you understand that it's important and you make sure that you give back on it, it's very unlikely that it's going to wither. But I don't have enough experience. Like maybe Kubernetes, I just got told the other day that I should stop identifying as a Kubernetes security expert because you're just a security expert. Oh, yes, that's true. I'm fresh and I'm passionate about it, but I do a whole bunch of other things and my skills are transferable. But I don't know is really the answer. I'm not sure. I think try and have, if you can show what other companies are using in open source projects, there's a little bit of like, okay, well, these other big companies are using it, and Kubernetes as an example is like the kind of companies that are using it are the kind of companies that are going to make sure that it's staying alive. But for small open source projects, it gets so tough. My husband gives me a bunch of trouble about this all the time. He's like, Kubernetes is like the blessed child of open source. It was made by Google. It's got so many contributors. You've got all these really nice passion projects made by real people, not big corporations. That's fair. Yeah.
But on the flip side, there are other open source projects that actually don't mean anymore. So, yeah, that happens.
Yeah.
In a way, yes, maybe Kubernetes is the blessed child, but that's a good thing.
It is a good thing. It is a good thing. It's just, I wish more projects. Kubernetes is also struggling for maintainers, but it's of such a different scale than projects that are like, we can't even review PRs, let alone build new issues for this because some company said we're cool, everyone adopted us, and no one came and helped us with the work. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
And you got a great presentation in the chat too.
Oh, good.